To make our Pong game a little bit better, we'd like to have a start button so that when we run our game, it waits for us to press the start button and then begins the game. So the first thing to do is to create a start button. So go over to your flaw file, use your rectangle tool. You can change the corners of your rectangle to be a little bit more curved by increasing the rectangle options. Choose a fill color. You can go ahead and draw your rectangle. Use your text tool and draw some text. Make sure your text is on top of your rectangle and group them together. Control G. Then go ahead and right click on that object, say convert to symbol, and press F8 and call it your start button. I already have a start button, so I'm going to name him start button 2. Then export for ActionScript. Press OK. Now delete him from the stage. This is in your library. So here's my start button that I've made before, and I made him the same way. Notice I just named him start button. Now back in your pong.as file, you're going to need to make an instance of start button. So underneath your class name, go ahead and make a private var, call him start button, and make him type start button. He's a movie clip, so he's capitalized. Our start button instance is not capitalized. Now in our constructor, we're going to make the start button a new start button. We'll set his X and Y values to be the middle of our stage, or wherever you want him to appear. We add him to our stage, and then we add an event listener that's going to listen for the mouse click, and when they click upon him, he will run this method called startClicked. Now importantly, if you're going to use this mouse event click, you're going to need to add that library to your import statements. So go ahead and add the import flash events mouse event. Now let's go ahead and look at that method called startClicked. So startClicked, I'll explain this code in a second. You can go ahead and comment that one out, and what it does is it calls this init method, initiation method. The init method has no parameters, so no arguments are sent in, and it returns type void. So we're going to make the init method our init function next. And all we did is I cut all of that code that was in our constructor before. So you probably had a whole bunch of code right here. This is where your other code was. And I went ahead and I cut all that code to the end of the constructor. I left his curly bracket, but I cut all of that code and just pasted it in the init method. So here's my constructor code. And it was all the code that we made before inside of our constructor. And this is the end of the init method now. So what happens is they press the button appears, waits to be pressed. When they click on the button, it runs this method. This method calls this function, and then the functions run, the game goes on. Okay, to see how this, click on the start button, but the start button is still there. We'd like it to disappear. To make our start button disappear, we're going to go ahead and edit it within our flaw file. To see how I edit it, let me double click on our start button. Here's how we edited it. Notice that we have keyframe and a keyframe on our actions layer. We have a keyframe and a keyframe on our labels layer. And on our button layer, we also have 2 keyframes. On our actions layer, in our first keyframe, we have the word stop. And in our second keyframe, we also have the word stop. In our labels layer, on the first keyframe in our labels layer, we named it on. In the second keyframe on our labels layer, we named it off. And on our button layer, on the first keyframe, we have our button. And on the second keyframe, we deleted the button. So that when we tell it to go to off, he will delete the button. So now in our code, when we want our start button to go to that off or go to frame 2, we tell it start button, go to and play off. We do this in the function called start clicked. So he goes to that off state, and then the init method is called, so that when we run our code, we click on the start button, he goes to his off state.